The lecture hall stretched before me like a monument to academic pretension, filled with 237 beings from across the galaxy. I, Professor Vex-Korial of the Zenthari Collective, stood at the podium, my 6 manipulator arms adjusting the holographic display with practiced precision. The topic today was predator species and their inevitable decline, a subject I had spent 4 decades researching. How ironic that I would be lecturing about predators while one sat in the back row pretending to take notes. The human female had introduced herself as Maya Torres when she enrolled in my xenobiology course 3 weeks ago. Average height for her species, brown hair pulled back in what they called a ponytail, wearing their typical casual clothing. Nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that screamed apex predator to my trained eye. But then again, that was the point, wasn't it? As we can observe from the data, I continued, my primary voice box resonating through the hall while my secondary one provided the universal translation. Predatory species across the galaxy follow predictable patterns. They rise, they dominate, and then they fall. The Catherian Empire lasted 3,000 years before their aggression turned inward. The Vaxan horde collapsed when they ran out of prey species to conquer. A tentacled student from Aquarius Prime raised one of his appendages. Professor, what about species that adapt? Surely some predators evolve beyond their base instincts. I allowed myself a small laugh, the sound coming out, as a chittering from my throat sax. My dear student, that is the beautiful tragedy of predator species. They cannot adapt beyond what they are. It is genetic, hardwired into their neural pathways. A scorpion cannot choose not to sting. A Vaxan cannot choose not to hunt, and I paused, my 4 eyes focusing on the back row. A human cannot choose not to be what they are. Maya Torres looked up from her tablet, meeting my gaze with those unsettling binocular eyes. She smiled, not the friendly smile of a herbivore, not the nervous grin of a prey species, but the patient, knowing smile of something that was very comfortable being underestimated. Ho! She knew that I knew, and I knew that she knew that I knew. Ho! This little game had been going on for weeks. Ho! This little game had been going on for weeks. The humans, I continued, clicking to the next slide, represent perhaps the most fascinating case study in predatory overreach. A species that managed to achieve interstellar travel despite their obvious limitations. Their homeworld, Earth, is a death world, by galactic standards. Gravity that would crush most civilized beings. An atmosphere that corrodes metal. Weather patterns that kill for sport. A few students laughed at that last part. Maya's smile widened. They emerged from this hostile environment as persistence hunters. I explained, warming to my favorite subject, chasing their prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. Their ancestors would literally run animals to death. Can you imagine such a horrific way to hunt? A student from the peaceful luminary system shuddered, her bioluminescent patches flickering with distress. Professor, surely they evolved past such barbarism? Oh, my naive student, I said, my voice dripping with academic condescension. They simply found new prey to exhaust. They call it economics and politics now. But it is the same behavior. They pursue, they wear down, they consume. The only difference is the scale. Maya raised her hand. My 4 hearts skipped a beat in perfect synchronization. Yes, Miss Torres, I asked, my voice carefully neutral. She stood up and I was reminded of how they moved. Not the careful, considered motions of civilized species, but the fluid, controlled grace of something that could explode into violence at any moment. Every human moved like they were ready to either flee or fight, and honestly that was terrifying. Professor Vex-Korial, she said, and her pronunciation of my name was flawless, which somehow made it worse. I was wondering if you had considered alternative interpretations of human behavior. Perhaps what you call persistence hunting could be viewed as patience, determination, and the ability to work toward long-term goals. The audacity, the sheer unmitigated audacity of this creature to challenge me in my own lecture hall. I could feel my secondary breathing apparatus fluttering with indignation. Miss Torres, I replied, my voice taking on the tone I reserved for particularly dense students. What you describe as patience is simply another word for the ability to delay gratification in service of a larger kill. What you call determination is the inability to recognize when prey has escaped and the hunt should end. These are not virtues, they are genetic compulsions. She nodded thoughtfully, as if actually considering my words. I see your point, Professor. But couldn't the same logic be applied to any species? After all, aren't you demonstrating persistence right now by spending decades studying predator species? Isn't your determination to prove your thesis just another form of hunting? The lecture hall fell silent.
Even the usual rustling of note-taking and whispered translations stopped.
236 pairs of eyes plus Maya's two focused on me, waiting for my response. I felt a chill run through my exoskeleton. This human, this predator, had just turned my own argument against me, and she had done it with that same patient smile. The difference, Miss Torres, I said, my voice carefully controlled, is that my research serves the greater good of galactic understanding. I am not hunting for personal gain or survival. I am seeking truth. Of course, she agreed, settling back into her seat. Just like humans seek truth when they explore new worlds, establish trade routes, or negotiate peace treaties, we're all just looking for truth, aren't we, Professor? Checkmate. Halime, the little predator, had just checkmated me without raising her voice or showing the slightest sign of aggression. She had used logic, patience, and that terrifying human ability to see 12 moves ahead in any conversation. I cleared my throat sacs and clicked to the next slide, desperate to regain control of my own lecture. Moving on, let us examine the economic patterns of predator species. But my mind was elsewhere. Maya Torres had just demonstrated exactly why humans were so dangerous. They did not roar and charge like the Kitharian Empire. They did not swarm and devour like the Vaxon horde. They smiled. They asked polite questions, and they systematically dismantled your arguments until you found yourself agreeing with them. The rest of the lecture passed in a blur. I covered the material I had presented hundreds of times before, but my attention kept drifting to the back row. Maya appeared to be taking diligent notes, occasionally nodding at particularly interesting points. She looked like the perfect student, which was of course exactly what made her so terrifying. As the lecture drew to a close, I announced the upcoming assignment, a comparative analysis of predator and prey species in their respective ecosystems. The students began packing their belongings with the usual post-lecture chatter. Maya approached my podium as the hall emptied. Up close, she was even more unsettling. Humans had this way of making direct eye contact that felt like a challenge even when they were being perfectly polite. Professor, she said, I wanted to thank you for such an enlightening lecture. I'm learning so much about how different species perceive each other. I am glad you find the material educational, I replied, my voice carefully neutral. She tilted her head slightly, another one of those predator mannerisms that looked innocent but felt loaded with meaning. I was wondering if you might have some time to discuss my assignment. I'm thinking of focusing on persistence hunting behaviors, but I want to make sure I'm approaching it from the right angle. Of course she did. Of course the human wanted to write about persistence hunting. It was probably going to be some elaborate justification of her species' predatory nature, wrapped in academic language. I suppose I could spare a few minutes, I said, gesturing toward my office with one of my secondary arms. My office was a monument to my academic achievements, degrees from 6 different universities, awards for research excellence, and shelves lined with publications on predator species behavior. Maya looked around with what appeared to be genuine interest. You've certainly done extensive research on this topic, she observed, examining one of my published papers. 23 years of fieldwork studying the collapse of the Kitharian Empire. That must have required incredible patience. There she went again, using my own words against me. I settled into my specialized chair, designed to accommodate my unique physiology. Miss Torres, I said, deciding to abandon pretense. What is it you really want? She looked genuinely surprised. I want to understand your perspective, Professor. You've spent your career studying species like mine, and I'm curious about your conclusions. My conclusions, I said slowly, are that predator species are fundamentally incompatible with long-term galactic civilization. They rise, they consume, they destroy, and they fall. It is inevitable. Maya nodded thoughtfully. And humans, where do we fit in this pattern? You are perhaps the most dangerous predator species we have encountered, I said. Honestly, the Kitharians were obvious in their aggression. The Vaxon were straightforward in their hunger. But humans are subtle. You integrate yourselves into galactic society. You follow the rules. You contribute to scientific advancement. And all the while, you are still predators. You have simply found more sophisticated prey. She was quiet for a long moment, considering my words. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. What if you're wrong, Professor? Impossible. The data is clear. But what if the data is incomplete? She pressed. What if you're looking at the symptom instead of the cause? What if the reason predator species fail isn't because they're predators but because they refuse to evolve? I laughed, the sound echoing off my office walls. Evolution is not a choice, Miss Torres. A species cannot simply decide to change its fundamental nature. Can't it? She asked. Humans used to hunt megafauna to extinction on Earth. We used to wage wars that devastated entire continents. We used to see other humans as prey. But we changed. We learned. We adapted. You adapted your methods, I corrected. You found more efficient ways to be predators. Or, she said, leaning forward slightly, we learned that cooperation was more effective than competition. We learned that building was more rewarding than destroying. We learned that the best way to ensure our species' survival was to help other species thrive. I stared at her, all four of my eyes focused on her disturbingly calm face. You are asking me to believe that humans have transcended their nature. I'm asking you to consider that what you call natures might just be a choice, she said, and that predator species fail not because they're genetically doomed, but because they choose to remain predators when they could choose to become something else. The silence stretched between us. Outside my office window, the binary suns of Xanthari Prime were setting, casting long shadows across the campus. Students from dozens of species walked the paths, heading to dormitories or evening meals, completely unaware that one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators was sitting in my office, calmly dismantling 40 years of my research. Miss Torres, I said finally, even if I were to accept your hypothesis, it would not change the fundamental threat that predator species represent. She smiled that patient smile again. Professor, may I ask you something personal? I gestured for her to continue. Why did you choose to study predator species? What drew you to this particular field of research? The question caught me off guard. Ma'am, it began as a survival necessity, understanding potential threats to galactic civilization. And now? I paused, considering.
Now it is.
I suppose you could say it has become a passion, the complexity of predator behavior, the patterns that emerge across different species, the way they adapt and evolve. It is fascinating. You hunt knowledge, she said quietly. You track patterns across decades, you pursue understanding with single-minded determination. You never give up until you have your answer. Professor Vex-Korial, by your own definition, you are a persistence hunter. The words hit me like a physical blow. My exoskeleton actually creaked as I leaned back in my chair. That is not the same thing, I managed to say. Isn't it? She asked. You've spent 40 years tracking the behavioral patterns of predator species. You follow leads across the galaxy. You exhaust every source of information. You never stop until you have cornered the truth you're hunting. The only difference is that your prey is knowledge instead of flesh. I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. She was right. By my own criteria, I was a predator, but that was impossible. I was Xanthari. We were herbivorous, peaceful, academic. We were prey species. Miss Torres, I said slowly, what exactly are you suggesting? She leaned back in her chair, that infuriating smile still playing on her lips. I'm suggesting, Professor, that maybe the line between predator and prey isn't as clear as you think. Maybe every species has the capacity for both behaviors. Maybe the question isn't whether a species is predatory, but whether they choose to use those traits constructively or destructively. My four hearts were beating in completely different rhythms now. This human, this supposed predator, was not trying to destroy my research. She was trying to elevate it, to push it toward a more complex understanding of species behavior. You are asking me to reconsider 40 years of work, I said. I'm asking you to consider that 40 years of work might be the foundation for the next 40 years of discovery. What if? What if predator species don't fail because they're predators? What if they fail because they stop learning? I sat in silence, processing her words. Outside, the campus was settling into evening quiet. The bioluminescent pathways were beginning to glow, guiding late students to their destinations. Miss Torres, I said finally, your assignment.
What exactly are you planning to write about?
She grinned, and for the first time it looked completely genuine rather than calculated. I want to write about the evolution of hunting behaviors in academic research, how the pursuit of knowledge demonstrates that predatory traits can be redirected toward beneficial outcomes. I stared at her. You want to write about me? I want to write about us, she said. Predator and prey. working together to understand the galaxy we share. I think it could be groundbreaking research. Before I could respond, she glanced at her wrist device and stood up. Professor, I hate to cut this short, but I have another commitment tonight. Would it be possible to continue this discussion tomorrow? I nodded absently, still processing everything she had said. Of course, my office hours are... I know, she said, gathering her things. Thank you for your time, Professor. This has been incredibly valuable. She paused at the door, turning back with that patient smile. Oh, and Professor, you might want to consider that the most successful predators are the ones that convince their prey to cooperate willingly. And with that, Maya Torres walked out of my office, leaving me alone with the terrifying realization that I had just been hunted by an expert. But the truly terrifying part was that I was looking forward to our next conversation. I spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of my residential pod, my 4 eyes taking shifts so that at least 2 were always focused on the phosphorescent patterns above. Sleep, that blessed escape from consciousness, remained frustratingly elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Maya Torres sitting in the back row, that patient smile playing across her features as she systematically dismantled 4 decades of my life's work. By morning, I had reached a conclusion that terrified me more than any Catherian war cry or vaccine-feeding frenzy. I was going to have to admit that a human might be right. The next day's lecture felt different. As I prepared my materials on territorial behaviors in extinct civilizations, I found myself glancing toward the back row before the hall had even filled. Maya arrived precisely on time, as she always did, carrying her tablet and wearing that same casual attire that somehow managed to look both harmless and predatory. Today, I began, my voice carrying across the lecture hall. We examined the Morvic sovereignty, a species that controlled 47 star systems before their empire collapsed due to territorial disputes. Maya raised her hand immediately. Of course she did. Yes, Miss Torres. She stood with that fluid grace that made my exoskeleton itch. Professor, before we discuss the Morvic collapse, could you clarify something about territorial behavior? Are we defining it as the defense of resources, or the expansion of controlled space? A reasonable question. A perfectly academic inquiry that any good student might ask. So why did it feel like she had just set a trap? Territorial behavior encompasses both aspects. I replied carefully. The defense of existing resources and the acquisition of new ones. I see, she said, nodding thoughtfully. So when humans established the Soul Trade Network, connecting Earth with 17 other systems through peaceful commercial agreements, would you classify that as territorial expansion? And there it was. The trap sprung with surgical precision. The human expansion model, I said, trying to maintain my academic composure, represents a more sophisticated form of territorial acquisition. Instead of direct conquest, humans use economic incentives and cultural exchange to establish influence. So cooperation is just conquest by other means? She asked, tilting her head with apparent curiosity. The other students were leaning forward now, sensing something unusual in the exchange. A crystalline student from the Helix Nebula whispered something to their neighbor, a young Aquarian's tentacles curled with nervous energy. In the case of predator species, yes, I said firmly. The methodology may evolve, but the underlying drive for territorial control remains constant. Maya smiled, not the patient, knowing smile I had come to associate with her verbal ambushes, but something warmer, almost fond. Professor, she said, what if I told you that the Soul Trade Network was actually designed by the Zenthari Collective's own economic modeling division? The lecture hall fell silent. Even the automated air recycling system seemed to pause. That is, I began, then stopped. That is impossible. Is it? She reached into her bag and pulled out a datapad, projecting a holographic document into the air above her seat. Authorization code ZC 4471 Alpha, dated 15 standard years ago. A proposal for sustainable multi-species economic integration submitted by the Zenthari Economic Council to the Human Colonial Administration. My 4 hearts stopped beating in sequence like falling dominoes. The proposal, Maya continued, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, recommended exactly the model that humans eventually implemented: mutual benefit rather than exploitation, shared resources rather than hoarded wealth, cultural exchange rather than assimilation. I stared at the document floating in the air. Even from across the lecture hall, I could see the Zenthari Collective's official seal, the authorization codes, The familiar formatting of our bureaucratic proposals. Where did you obtain that document? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. From my advisor, she said simply, Dr. Kex Morton, of the Xenthary Economic Council. He thought it might be relevant to my research on interspecies cooperation. Kex Morton, my clutch brother. My own family member had provided this human with the ammunition to destroy my life's work.
Whole.
Professor, Maya continued, and her voice had taken on a gentler tone. Did you know that human colonial policy for the last 20 years has been based almost entirely on Xenthary behavioral models? Your people taught us that sustainable expansion requires the consent and participation of existing populations. The student near the front, a brave little luminary female, raised one of her glowing appendages. Miss Torres, are you saying that humans learned cooperation from the Xenthary? I'm saying, Maya replied, that humans learned from everyone. Xenthary economic models, Aquarian social structures, luminary consensus building techniques, even Catherian strategic planning, minus the genocidal aspects. She looked directly at me, and her expression was no longer that of a predator toying with prey. It was the look of a researcher presenting findings to a colleague. Humans are persistence learners, Professor. We don't just hunt animals or resources or territory. We hunt knowledge, techniques, solutions. We pursue understanding until we find it, and then we adapt it to our needs. The implications crashed over me like a tidal wave on an Aquarian breeding beach. If Maya was right, if humans were not conquering through superior force but through superior adaptation, then everything I thought I knew about predator species was wrong. But the pattern, I said desperately, every predator species follows the same pattern. Rise, dominance, collapse. Do they? Maya asked. Or do they follow that pattern because they refuse to change? What if the pattern isn't inevitable? What if it's just the result of species that hunt the same prey in the same way until there's nothing left to hunt? She gestured to the holographic document still floating above her seat. Humans could have followed the standard pattern. We had the technology, the aggression, the territorial instincts, but we chose to hunt something different. What? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Solutions, she said simply. We hunt solutions to problems. The problem of resource scarcity, so we hunt sustainable alternatives. The problem of territorial conflicts, so we hunt cooperative frameworks. The problem of species extinction, so we hunt preservation methods. A Helix Nebula student raised their crystalline appendage, but Miss Torres, doesn't that still make humans predators? You're still hunting, still pursuing, still using those same instincts. Maya's grin was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Exactly. We are predators. Professor Vex-Korial is absolutely right about that, but he's wrong about what it means. She turned to face me directly.
Being a predator isn't a limitation, Professor.
It's a tool.
The question isn't whether a species is predatory, it's what they choose to hunt. The lecture hall erupted in discussion. Students who had never spoken to each other were suddenly engaged in animated debates about predator behavior, adaptation, and species evolution. The careful academic atmosphere I had cultivated for decades dissolved into something chaotic and alive, and in the middle of it all, Maya Torres stood quietly watching me with those patient eyes. I raised one of my primary manipulator arms for silence. The chatter died down gradually. Miss Torres, I said, my voice steady, despite the earthquake happening in my worldview, you have presented compelling evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about predator species behavior. However, this raises new questions about the long-term sustainability of the human model. She nodded respectfully. What questions, Professor? If humans are indeed persistence learners, as you suggest, what happens when you have learned everything there is to learn? What do you hunt when there are no more solutions to find? The question hung in the air like a charged particle waiting to discharge. Maya considered it seriously, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. That's a good question, she admitted. And honestly, I don't know the complete answer, but I have a theory. Please share it. She looked around the lecture hall, taking in the diverse collection of species that made up my student body. I think the universe is big enough and complex enough that there will always be new problems to solve, new understanding to pursue. But even if that weren't true, even if we reached some theoretical limit of knowledge, she paused. And when she continued, her voice carried a note of something I had never heard from her before. Hope. I think we would hunt new ways to help other species solve their problems. I think we would hunt ways to make the galaxy a better place for everyone, not just humans. And you base this theory on what evidence? I asked. On this, she said, gesturing to the lecture hall around us. A human sitting in a Xenthari university, learning from a professor who has spent 40 years studying her species, engaged in academic discourse with students from 12 different star systems. This is what humans hunt now, Professor. Understanding, connection, ways to build instead of destroy. A luminary student near the middle raised her appendage. But what about human colonies that have failed? What about the conflicts in the outer rim? Maya nodded acknowledgement. Humans aren't perfect. We still have individuals and groups that follow the old patterns, that choose to hunt territory or resources or power. But the difference is that now, those individuals are opposed by other humans who have chosen to hunt different prey. She looked back at me. The most dangerous humans, Professor, aren't the ones who prey on other species. They're the ones who hunt corruption, injustice, and harmful systems. They're the ones who persistently pursue solutions to galactic problems, even when it takes decades or centuries. The pieces were falling into place in my mind like a complex xenobiological puzzle. Maya Torres had not come to my class to challenge my research. He had come to evolve it. Miss Torres, I said slowly, your assignment. What exactly are you proposing to write? She smiled. And this time it was neither patient nor predatory. It was excited. I want to co-author a paper with you, Professor. Adaptive predation. A new model for understanding species evolution in galactic civilization. I think your 40 years of research, combined with current human behavioral data, could revolutionize how we understand species interaction. The audacity was breathtaking. A human student was asking me, a tenured professor with 6 advanced degrees, to collaborate on research that would fundamentally challenge the field I had helped establish. It was exactly the kind of persistent, patient, long-term strategy that I had spent decades warning other species about. And it was brilliant. The implications of such research, I said carefully, would extend far beyond academic circles. If we are correct, it would suggest that any species, regardless of their evolutionary background, could choose to become constructive predators. Yes, she said simply. It would mean that the galactic civilizations we assumed were doomed could potentially adapt and thrive. Yes. It would mean that the line between predator and prey is not fixed, and that cooperation is not just possible but optimal. Yes. I looked around the lecture hall at my students, representing dozens of species from across the galaxy. Each one was listening intently, engaged in a discussion that could reshape how they understood themselves and their place in the universe. Miss Torres, I said finally, such a collaboration would require extensive fieldwork, detailed behavioral analysis, and probably several years of intensive research. Her grin was answer enough. It would mean working closely with human colonies, studying their integration methods, documenting their long-term sustainability. I have contacts in 17 different systems, she said. It would mean challenging academic conventions that have stood for centuries. I have patience, she said. I looked at her for a long moment. This human who had walked into my lecture hall and systematically hunted down every assumption I had about her species. Maya Torres, the persistence learner who had chosen to hunt not my pride or my position, but my understanding. Very well, I said, but I have conditions. Name them. First, we do this properly. Full academic rigor, peer review, multiple verification sources. Agreed. Second, if our hypothesis proves incorrect, we publish those results as well. The truth, whatever it turns out to be. Agreed. Third, I said, and I could not quite keep the amusement out of my voice, you stop sitting in the back row. If we are going to revolutionize xenobiology together, you might as well sit where I can see you properly. Maya Torres laughed, and the sound was nothing like the careful, calculated responses she had been giving me for weeks. It was genuine, delighted, and completely human. Deal, Professor. As the other students began filing out of the lecture hall, chattering excitedly about the discussion they had just witnessed, Maya approached the podium. Up close, she still looked like exactly what she was, a predator. But now I understood that being a predator was not the problem. The problem was what you chose to hunt. Professor, she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of agreement. I think this is going to be the beginning of a very interesting partnership. I reached out with my primary manipulator arm and grasped her hand carefully. Human skin was surprisingly warm, and their grip was firm without being threatening. Miss Torres, I replied, I believe you have just demonstrated the most sophisticated hunting technique I have ever encountered. What's that? You have successfully hunted down a research partner, I said, and made them grateful for the privilege of being caught. Maya Torres, persistence learner, solution hunter, and the most terrifying student I had ever taught, smiled that patient smile one more time. Welcome to the future of predator-prey relationships, Professor. I think you're gonna love what we discovered together. As she walked out of the lecture hall, I realized that she had been right about everything. Humans were predators, dangerous and persistent, and utterly relentless. They just happened to be hunting for ways to make the galaxy a better place. And frankly, that was the most human thing of all.